program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Inside Podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and with me is Ashkan, Watch Mojo's CEO and co-founder. How are you today, Ash?
I'm very good. Again, kind of blown away that it's almost December, but that's, I guess, normal with the passage of time.
Doesn't that happen every year? Everybody's surprised by Christmas somehow. It just kind of sneaks up on you.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's the good part. That Christmas is such a nice holiday that in the lead up to it, and then it's like downhill after New Year's when it's just dark and gray and cold. But then we have summer to look forward to, so it's all good.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about living in a place with 4 seasons. You always have something to look forward to.
And so it's beautiful.
For anybody who is new to this podcast, we've been covering a different topic every week. Earlier this year, we started by doing 20 episodes on YouTube. It's YouTube's 20th anniversary this year, as well as WatchMojo's 20th anniversary. So that was kind of a deep dive into the platform that we've made our home. And since then, we've covered a variety of topics on this show. We looked at America, capitalism, censorship, AI, and several others. And today we're diving deep into the topic of conspiracies. And I already see in the comments people throwing out their favorites. Dead Internet Theory already has one up there. So let's, I guess, start off. We have a clip prepared that kind of, I think, demonstrates the essence of how we feel about conspiracy theories. So maybe we can start with that, Yvonne.
Certain people I have no time for. Like if you're sexist or homophobic, or if you don't believe in conspiracy theories. I just don't understand, how do you not believe in any conspiracy theories? I understand not all of them, not most of them, but you don't believe in any conspiracy theory? You just think the government's just batting 1,000 and telling us the whole truth? Conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Watch Mojo audience would agree, because we've published our fair share of videos about conspiracy theories, and they always seem to get a lot of views. People are interested. There's a lot of comments and engagement. What do you make of that, Ash?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think conspiracy theories, to put it into context of why humans are drawn to them, I think, what separates, we've covered this, what separates humans from other animals, mammals, especially bigger ones? Like, why don't lions and elephants roam the world? We've covered this. It's like classroom. What's the one thing that separates humans?
Self-awareness, I guess, is one of them.
That could be it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that, you're right. Maybe a goat on a mountain isn't self-aware or aware of the surroundings before a wolf eats it. No, but it's storytelling. Right. Storytelling is what allowed the prophets to get people to convert. Storytelling is what gets a king to rule over people through the sword or the word. So I think when it comes to storytelling, in an ideal world, you want people with principles who speak the truth, who are transparent, who have candor. But that's not really true. Oftentimes, for you to get what you want, as a parent, sometimes you don't lie, but you kind of, stretch the truth, so to speak. Mm-hmm. You apply that to politics, if you apply that to social, settings, you can understand why, unfortunately, people lie. That's how they get what they want. So if you kind of go through the motions throughout history, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have public records, so you kind of believed what you were told. And I also think it starts off with one's family. Like if you were in a family where your dad was like, oh, the government is always lying, or your mom was kind of gullible and went along with everything she heard, then there's a good chance that you grow up having a certain disposition. And so when we started Watch Mojo, because history, I know people today are like, why don't you just do entertainment? But we were doing history videos before as well. And so I think, when it comes to history, there's a difference between governments that withhold information and you just thinking that everything is connected and there was this grand plan. My takeaway is I believe in most conspiracy theories, by the way, but I do believe that people give way too much credit to government. These are entities that cannot function properly. Nobody gets along. So you think that all these people came together, got in a room and said, we're going to do, citizens in a certain way. So I kind of believe both. I do think there's a lot of conspiracies that are probably true, but I also think humans have just lost the script, and especially nowadays, everything is kind of takes on a greater dimension than it is.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've kind of realized about government as I've looked into the UAP/UFO topic in depth with the Unveiled podcast, is that a lot of the people, especially some that have been working on the inside of the government, paint a picture of a very disjointed and like not a very harmonious organization. It's a lot of different people with different agendas, often competing with each other. But from the outside, you would assume that it's a super well-oiled, organized machine that is executing this finely tuned plan, but that isn't really the case. Do you think that Western society is a lot more secular than other societies of the past? Do you think that religions and gods have been replaced in some scenarios by conspiracy theories because as just a way to understand the things that are happening around us?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it's very deep and philosophical. I think at first it's more science, if we're going to be candid. I think science has replaced religion, meaning you're replacing beliefs and opinion with the truth, meaning something that could be tested, quantified, replicated to see if it's actually, accurate or not. So to start off with, since you brought it up, and I know we'll do Inside God or Inside Religion at some point, people will love that. But, thousands of years ago, we didn't really understand why there was lightning, why people died. Science wasn't what it is today. So there were wise people who ultimately were the prophets, the disciples, priests, sheikhs, rabbis, whatever, who kind of sought to explain, citing books that were just stories that were told and passed from generation to generation. So I think the first thing that replaced religion and God was more science. I think that is long, a trend that will continue. Now, to your question, I think that when you live in a world where maybe you disagree with the way people conduct themselves socially, the way people, just are with one another, also if you have hardships, if you struggle, whether it's with addiction or you commit a crime, then I think that's how religion gets back into your life. With regards to conspiracy theory, I think it's more that there is a shift in information with mass media. So when you started with like Gutenberg's printing press, when you started with radio, television, magazines, but really the internet blew this up, where anybody could have a website and now social media channels where they could disseminate whatever that they want. What is really the fine line between factually 100% accurate when even, by the way, the news was always still subjective and opinionated, even the words that you use, a terrorist is a freedom fighter, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what's happening now is infinite voices who want to cut through the clutter. They realize that, they have to push the envelope and say crazier and crazier things. And frankly, this is led by politicians, which are the worst of the worst, pushing the envelope more and more. But so you also understand that, like, well, if you put out a story or you retweet something that whatever, the Jews were behind 9/11 or Muslims are about to implement Sharia law everywhere, there may be truth to some of it, but mostly you're making it up to cut through the clutter. So I think this is just, it's more a reflection, I think, of society and technology and mass media where, what was it that William Randolph Hearst would say to the photographer during the Spanish-American War? You give me the pictures, I'll give you the headlines, and we'll kind of shift, the discourse among society to where we want to take it.
Yeah. Let's go over a few definitions before we go further into this. So the definition of conspiracy is a criminal plot being orchestrated by more than two people. Or two or more people. Conspiracy theory is a hypothesis of this plot. So often the two are conflated, or the terms are confused, but the theory is just the hypothesis of the plot. And state secrecy is something else to consider, which is legitimately classified operations, which is a whole other thing that we can get into also, because we don't want to assume that every piece of information should be made public. There are cases where, secrets can legitimately be kept, but not in all cases. Such as things that are for national security purposes, things that might, maybe.
I guess again, national security threat, it's usually one's government and the shit that they do behind the scenes. But now I'm sounding like conspiracy theorists. I have a question for you regarding that definition.
Sure.
In your first definition of conspiracy, does it always require a criminal act, or could it be just something that is nefarious, not positive, possibly even like mischievous, but not necessarily criminal?
That's a good question. My definition here says criminal plot, but I don't know, strictly speaking, if anything against the law.
I mean, I think that's like an important nuance for like the show and this theme, which is if all conspiracies are required to be criminal, then, you know, I'm not so sure that there are that many conspiracies, to be honest with you, because the reality is that very few of these things are illegal. You know, if the government of America, yesterday was a great example. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was in DC hanging out with Trump. A very courageous but professional journalist from ABC asked about the connection with 9/11 and, you know, the optics of MBS being there with Trump. Trump obviously went typical nuclear mode, but there is a fundamental difference between the US government saying, yeah, you know what, 9/11 bad 20 years ago, but today, and I'm not condoning this, by the way, but today, you know, we view Saudi Arabia as an ally. We need the oil, or we need them to kind of join the Abraham Accord. So you know what? We're not going to necessarily put a big emphasis on the connection that there were 19 Saudis, or 15 out of 19 were Saudis. I mean, to me, unethical, possibly even treasonous in a figurative sense. But to your point, if the government's like the pros outweigh the cons, I don't see that as criminal in a very narrow sense. Both conspiracies, but I'm just saying that I think the world that we live in has gone far beyond things that have to be illegal. I think it's just we have a tendency to look for excuses and explanations. We don't look in the mirror. We blame the system. I've always commented, you know, the youth that study you know, revisionist history of the purple-haired people, like, and they think that is a degree that's going to help them get a job. They don't get a job, and then they blame the man or capitalism. When you should look in the mirror, you're a moron for studying that. It's just plain and simple. You wasted 4 years of your life. You wasted all this money. Become realistic. So they blame the system. Similarly, a lot of people these days, like with COVID or whatever, like I personally with COVID was like, we don't know, like if, you know, if they want us to take a vaccine, it's probably not a conspiracy. It's because these masters themselves don't know. If they want us to wear a mask, I don't think there's this big conspiracy, but they don't know, right? But there's a big tendency, and I don't judge people if they're like, no, I think vaccines are bullshit, or, well, vaccines are bullshit. I think we passed that point, because when was the last time somebody had polio? But, you know, with regards to COVID, there was this whole cottage industry of conspiracy theories, and I do think some of it just got plain silly. And I don't think that helps, because like for us, as we get bigger, I do think you do become more mainstream in your ways. You know, like if we put out something today where we're like, we are sure that the Spanish government was behind 9/11. If you put that out in 2006, you're not credible unless you explain it. And then maybe you are like, okay, they may be onto something. But, you know, if like the New York Times puts out something that's clearly laughable, then they lose credibility. So that's also like the not correcting, but the self-withholding mechanism of conspiracies, that you don't want to seem like a lunatic. You know, I grew up hearing my dad once mention that he saw a UFO when I was very young. So that I don't remember. And then when I was about 9, we came outside of our house and everybody was looking up. There was something in the sky. And in Montreal, those that know, our tallest building, Place Ville-Marie, there was a light that goes around. So it wasn't that, just to be clear. This was more like circular in nature above us. It wasn't like one. And so as an 8, 9-year-old, I mean, my recollection was this was a UFO. It was unidentified. I'm not saying it was aliens, like blue people with...
Well, that's the strict definition of UFO. It's unidentified.
So, but what I'm saying is today with social media, there would be like a bunch of videos that would be disputed or not. So I think it's just a reflection of society. It's a reflection of technology, you know, and the problem is that when there is smoke, there's no longer necessarily indication that there's fire. It just shows that there's smoke. Now, what is that smoke? Go find out.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the psychology of people too. And one other element of that is, you mentioned like the evolutionary process of human beings. Pattern seeking is something that we've developed as kind of a safety mechanism. We want to be able to connect the dots and you know, oh, the grass is rustling over there. maybe it's a tiger, maybe I should get ready to run. And I think that's what a lot of people still carry with them. So when they see evidence of that could be, assumed to be something nefarious, the tendency is to connect those dots and make those hypotheses. So like that seems like another evolutionary thing that we've just come to that continues to this day.
But what I've also seen is, 20 years in business, when it comes to like legal disputes, resolutions, and we talked about this actually even in the Inside the Holy Land episode, where, you got to compromise and you got to find a middle ground with people. I find that we live in a world where two people will look at the same phenomenon and come away with very, very different conclusions and interpretations. And this is in the era of Wikipedia, Google, ChatGPT. There's a ton of research. Now, yes, you're going to find articles that support your thesis. You're going to find articles that dispute your thesis, but it's ultimately pretty easy to go and educate yourself. However, if you think of most conspiracies that we still talk about today, whether it's JFK, there's things around the world, that in whether it's in Iran or whether it's in the US or whether it's in China, I feel much of it has to do with just lack of documentation. But the fact that today people could look at 3 planes hitting, this is actually good. 2 people could look at the World Trade Center being slammed by planes and still say this was made up, which to me is just a sign of a lack of intelligence, lack of intellectual honesty. But the same person that goes, that is pushing it, I'm pretty sure that was real, like 99.9%. I'm not on drugs that are that strong, but the Pentagon video, I don't doubt it that another group of those crazies slammed a plane in the Pentagon. I don't think there's enough people that could lie about that. But when you look at the video footage, very different, right? If you look at the arguments that well, how come this only made this limited damage? Mm-hmm. That's a conversation you can have, but you still kind of go, okay, so 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, but then the US government said we're going to fly somehow a missile into the Pentagon. You understand? So it's that you talk about pattern, it's like a circumstantial evidence. If those planes legitimately slammed into the World Trade Center, then the odds that the Pentagon plane was a dupe, that's probably unlikely. It was probably a plane, but the footage just missed that frame. Now, I don't think if somebody questioning the Pentagon is crazy. But to me, somebody questioning the World Trade Center, the plane aspect, not other stuff about, I do think the government was well aware of threats. Then as a finance guy, I remember there were tremendous put options, which is the right to sell. There were tremendous put options that were bought against airline stocks. And then the owner of the World Trade Center, I think the gentleman's name was Silverstein or Silverberg, he bought an insurance policy treating each plane as a separate incident. So he paid a higher premium for his insurance for a scenario that is so unlikely that, again, I'm not necessarily buying into it, but I'm like, okay, something was up. But now does that mean that 19 Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, whatever you want to call them, did they not do that? No, they absolutely did that. It wasn't freaking George Bush's distant, slow-witted cousin that did that. It was clearly who did that. But so this is also the problem, that there are parts of so-called conspiracy theories that I think are fair game. They're legit to be disputed. But then the problem is, imagine we're having a conversation and one guy comes out and goes, aliens slammed those planes into the World Trade Center. Then you're like, this guy's crazy. We can't have this conversation.
So then it's then you don't even have dots to connect. It's where did this information come from? One of the things that I point to that's weird about 9/11, since we're just on that, is how I think it was the day before or shortly before, the Pentagon announced $21 trillion were unaccounted for in their spending. And then after the 9/11, that was quickly forgotten about. Nobody really looked into it too closely, and we never got an answer for that. But that's a question of that's a legitimate problem, and that should be looked into. And it's for reasons like that, I think, that people get suspicious also, because there are so many sketchy practices that are just out in the open, and then people are looking for more reasons and possibilities of why this should be occurring.
But I don't think, what's the expression? I don't think correlation is causality.
Mm-hmm.
Like JFK. So I grew up, by the way, loving conspiracy theories. I used to watch Unsolved Mysteries. It was the show, I believe, Wednesday evenings with the spooky music. It was great. Now, it was a lot of murders. It was a lot of missing people, but it definitely veered into conspiracy theories as well. So, with JFK, oh yeah, this guy, love this guy, Robert Stack, I think. Anyway, so with JFK, look, like somebody was like, oh, he was trying to ensure that Israel would not be nuclear. Okay, fine. Did Mossad kill him? Possibly. I don't think so. But it's not that side. I don't think that there's enough cohesion between the FBI, the CIA, levels of government to really pull off a conspiracy, and jumping back to 9/11, I understand a lot of people that were like, well, the same day the news sources were already pointing to Osama bin Laden. I have a very good memory. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, I was at the office at my old company, and also it was a small company. We're like 10 people. I was the only Muslim, as much as I'm agnostic atheist. I was different in that sense.
Sure.
I knew who was behind it. It wasn't the crazy Jehovah's Witnesses, it wasn't the whatever, like the Christian, the Orthodox Christians who were behind it. I kind of understood, but I immediately found an article about Osama bin Laden and I sent it to the team, kind of to preempt, being like, okay, I know who's behind this. And I was like, I think this is the guy. Now, I was a young 20-something. Obviously, I was curious and I was researching a ton, but I'm just saying, for somebody to be like, oh, the government was quick to blame Osama bin Laden, I assure you, it was pretty clear it was Osama bin Laden. He had said it, he admitted it, and even a guy like me, some pleb nobody in Montreal, kind of put two and two together. So again, correlation is not causality, but it's also fun. Like, that's the point that I think people miss. To quote Johnny Carson, Americans prefer to be entertained than educated and informed. So you give me a good old-fashioned conspiracy theories, especially if it involves the blacks, the Jews, the Muslims, the lesbians, like some group that you could just pick on, people will believe that a lot more. Or also, obviously, always government, the elite. Like, as if it's like people think that like rich people sit around and agree on anything. Have you ever heard two really, really successful billionaires talk about anything?
I've never
I've
never spoken to two successful billionaires, so.
Well, what I'm saying, no, but it's like the conspiracy about like Iranians or Jewish people. People are always like some monolithic, like, like-minded. I'm like, these people don't agree about what time it is. They're not going to pull off some kind of conspiracy, folks. It's not going to happen. But anyway.
So going from the conspiracy theories like JFK, 9/11 to real conspiracies that actually happened. So we have a WatchMojo video, one of many. This one's called Top 20 Government Conspiracy Theories That Turned Out to Be True. And there's many examples. There's the MK Ultra experiments that the CIA conducted on people for mind control, experiments. There's Operation Ajax, which involves a coup on Iran, which was the subject of one of our previous episodes. Iran, not the coup.
But I mean,
but you look like you're going to say something. Go ahead.
No, well, the drugs is different. Again, I'm not defending, just to be very clear. To me, like the notion that you are going to have doctors, scientists who are involved with pharmaceutical or government agencies conduct tests on people who may already be sick and stuff. Is that is it a conspiracy? Again, if it's illegal, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's like, well, how do you think that drug that your aunt takes to not die at 50 from blood pressure came to be? Not defending it, but I'm saying that to me is plausible. Whether or not it was unethical, illegal, I'll let the lawyers discuss that. But just to show you how narratives are also nonsense, I am a pretty well-informed individual. I myself used to be like, oh yeah, the US and the UK in Operation Ajax, they toppled a democratically elected prime minister, which is false. Like, that is not the case. It was like a king. You could disagree with the monarchy. As an entrepreneur, I don't like monarchies in general, but that was a king who basically put a prime minister in his place using the constitutional monarchy, parameters that were part of the law. But the narrative that like the US and the UK went in and toppled some kind of like Gandhi, it just goes to show that these conspiracies are also generally used by people with less than noble intentions to make their point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to be like America is this big bad, and by the way, I love America and I love Americans, but I've criticized American foreign policy all the time. I criticize all governments, right? So it is absolutely true that the US had a foreign policy that was all about going around, stirring shit up, controlling natural resources, controlling everything really. And for sure, they played a part along with the Brits in Operation Ajax, but the real culprit were Iranians. To blame the Brits is really naive. It's the Iranians who shot themselves in the foot. So similarly, I think, and I mean, we did this list, obviously, like it's stuff that we cover and we still believe in, but I still think that a lot of it is just people liking a good old fashioned tale that is entertaining, that is intriguing. It leaves more questions than answers, because once you know the ending of a movie, you stop watching, right? But if you still are like sitting there going, well, who was behind 9/11? And what was it? Why did the U.S. leave Afghanistan? The answer is, what's that razor?
Occam's razor. Yeah, like, the most logical explanation is the simplest one. Yeah, I mean, we keep going back to 9/11. I just think it's like a very interesting case, but I also think that it was also the subsequent events which happened for years afterwards that kept fueling the fire of the conspiracy theories, with the search for weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. And that was like, everybody was being hit over the head with how important it is to find the weapons of mass destruction. But then also, the United States conveniently got a whole lot of oil out of their invasion of the Middle East.
Well, it was accessible because they spent trillions, and it precipitated the end or the decline of the American empire, which, again, I'm not anti-American at all. The average empire lasts 250 years. 2026 will be 250. So one thing about that, again, to just the devil's in the details. So absolutely, General Wesley Clark enumerated 7 states that they wanted to regime change. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria. I could go on, Sudan, there's a few, there were 7 in all. And absolutely, I agree that the US, especially the so-called neocon cabal, whatever, the Wolfowitzes, the Abrams, the Cheneys, may he burn in hell 8 times over. And I usually don't say anything bad about people, but fucking Darth Vader, we could make an exception for him. But the point I'm getting at is, yes, without a doubt, especially since they were caught with their pants down, I do believe that the U.S. government was like, F this, we're going to use this to now go do what we want. And look, the mere fact that 15 out of 19 of the perpetrators were Saudis, Saudi never got bombed. Not encouraging Saudi to get bombed. Yesterday, our millennial crown prince in Saudi Arabia, he kind of actually answered that pretty well. He's like, Osama bin Laden's goal was to use 9/11 to create a rift between America and Saudi, a relationship that goes back to the 20th century, at least, with the discovery of oil. So I 100% believe that 9/11 was weaponized, bastardized, to go implement a disastrous foreign policy. But if that means that somehow Bush, who has like a 70 IQ, that Bush would sit there with Cheney and the whole gang of criminals to say, let's go and somehow brainwash 15, actually, let's go find 20 Jews, pretend that they're Arab Muslims, and slam them. You know what I mean? Like, once you start going that rabbit hole, you're like, yeah, this makes no sense. Like, this is clearly. So again, details matter. I don't think there was that big of a conspiracy regarding the act. But whether or not that act was used to do certain shady things, yeah, absolutely clear. I mean, they kind of admitted it even,
So let's talk about the shift in the digital age that we've seen with conspiracy theories. So like the 9/11 that happened around the early 2000s, turn of the millennium. But in more recent years with the internet and now AI and everything like that, we've seen kind of like a different tone to a lot of the conspiracy theories that circulate. A lot of them have more of like a game, almost like a clue or something like that. You know, you have QAnon. It's like, put the pieces together. What's the secret message? This and that. The Pizzagate, looking for little clues here and there and evidence. It seems like there's been a gamification or something like that in the conspiracy.
So, we obviously cover media history, and we've talked about one-dimensional media, static media, dynamic media. So look, I think in an era of, like, let's just use 1963, November 22nd, which is soon, JFK gets his brains blown out in Dallas. We blame Harvey Lee Oswald. There was obviously video footage, grainy, not very conclusive. Today, there would be 1,001, not just social smartphones, but there would be cameras everywhere. So my opinion about this stuff is the more media proliferates, becomes multimedia, so video, not just audio, not just text, not just grainy images, not just word of mouth, you get this weird bifurcation where both you would think you could use visuals to dispute conspiracies. But, and we're getting to this now, as media became actually more rich and now gone exponentially richer with AI, where it could create things, it goes back to what I said. Everybody has a voice, everybody has a platform, but there's so much clutter that you have to come out and say crazier and crazier things. Politicians are a great example. To get to voters, to get funding, to get whatever they need to do, they move away from talking points to incitement, because again, generally, if you want to succeed in politics, you have to play the extremes. If you're too much in the middle, you would think you would win, but you don't. So I think this is just, unfortunately, going to dramatically get worse. And with AI, I mean, oftentimes I now start a lot of, if I see something on X and I want to share it, I'm like, assuming this is not AI, assuming this is real. But, we live in very, very interesting times where there's this, despite people supposedly having an education, they're actually very uneducated. There's, I'm not talking literacy, reading. I'm just saying knowing history, understanding common sense. So this is going to be a bigger and bigger thing. And it's exacerbated, not because traditional media was necessarily truthful, but there was this expectation that, like, Peter Jennings is not lying to me in a manipulative way. Tom Brokaw is not trying to, he's not stop the cap. Like, now you see an article, you see a video on some random person's social handle. I mean, do you vet that person? Generally, you don't. You just share it. You're, impatient. So this is going to escalate. And this is also why at WatchMojo, I'm not really a stickler for many things, but I am a bit like, okay, we don't want to lose credibility. It's good to push the envelope, but we're not here for clickbait. We're not here to lie or manipulate or just slander people and things just for that view. Credibility matters. Now, does it matter enough if you don't get the viewers, you then go out of business? There is this kind of like gravity effect, unfortunately, where you do, people, not us, you do have this like incitement to add to the problem instead of address it.
Yeah. Do you think that there's any danger with AI and deep fakes and stuff like that, that we're entering a sort of post-truth era?
Were we ever in a pre-truth or truth era? You know what I mean? Like, I was born in Iran where all the state media was propaganda and lies. I was too young to see it. I came here, which again was compared to that hell, maybe like great. You turn on your news. Are these really the stories that matter, or that the stories that somebody just decided? It is relative though, right? So I actually think that if you have the time, if you're not lazy, if you're intellectually honest, you have the opportunity to get to the so-called truth with a little bit more work, but the tools are there. I think the problem is that, again, we sometimes, and this was a fair question last week, like, why would we cover Inside the Holy Land if we're known for Batman? And I explained it. This is a podcast. It's a different format. Specifically, this is where we do other stuff. But if you look at the people that now on social try to break the misinformation, they generally get a lot less views or likes or whatever than the original source of misinformation.
Yeah.
Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in. So it's not so much that we're in post-truth. It's again that people are just, 90% of people are generally lean back. The content, they're not going out there proactively looking for the information. It just kind of lands on their lap, either through their timeline or however. And I don't think people take that extra step. This is a joke, but once on social, I think I posted like, oh, my wife is leaving me for, I think, Justin Bieber, which obviously doesn't make sense, but there must have been a reason. My mom called me and she was like, is everything all right? And I put Justin Bieber, right? She called me and she was like, is everything all right? And I was like, oh my God, I can't joke about anything anywhere. Even something that ludicrous didn't like set off the alarm that this is probably a joke. So it doesn't surprise me, and if people were not lazy with information, WatchMojo would not exist. If you think about it, WatchMojo's success is because we summarize, we research, we curate, and we do care about being accurate. We'll make mistakes. So if you think about it, there's this whole cottage industry of curators and summarizers because people are lazy. They're not going to go do the research themselves.
There's laziness, and then there's also just gullible people too. Like you mentioned, like, I don't know, elderly people are, there's notoriously scams, telephone scams for getting, credit card information and other personal information from elderly people because they just don't see it coming because that wasn't a thing when they were, in their prime or growing up. It's kind of like something that snuck up on them without them realizing. But I think that one important thing to consider is that other countries know that this is an issue. I mean, I'm sure it's an issue around the world, but particularly in North America, with the kind of, echo chambers that exist and people arguing about things, different sides of the political spectrums and everything. There have been instances where, Russia, China have leveraged social media and things like that to sow, conspiracy theories, disagreements between people. It's happened during elections. There's been all kinds of nefarious things happening from other countries. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so
conspiracies as a tool of war, basically.
So you mentioned China and Russia. I've been to both. What do you think about, what is a commonality between those two countries?
I mean, lack of democracy would be one commonality between them. And so they, the desire to influence America's elections probably, I would assume, is a priority for them.
Okay. But let's go with that first one, right? So, I mean, I visited, I've never lived. I lived in Iran briefly, but doesn't really count. But if you think of Iran, if you think of Iraq, if you think of Syria, these were all authoritarian states who also used people to turn on one another. Literally, like there's Farsi expressions where like the walls are listening, meaning your neighbors are listening, meaning they're going to call the police and say you're some kind of infidel or whatever. So, or plotting against the state. So I think, yes, sociology explains a lot. I think in societies where individual liberties and information is limited and controlled, there is a tendency for there to be more conspiracies, to be more whispering, to be more paranoia. It's a feature. It's not a bug, right? You're like, oh, Bashar al-Assad's people are going to come take me out of my bed in the middle of the night and shoot me in the head and throw me in a ditch. In Canada and in the US, forget freedom of speech. Like, yes, there is police brutality, there is corruption, but the odds of you kind of in the middle of the night being unfairly treated is lower than in Iraq during Saddam Hussein. Now, I also think that then just, it's like chicken or egg. Are the countries that were, excuse the language, these countries are great with great people. I'm talking about the overall, political climate. Are the shithole countries shitholes because of some foreign hand, the America, big bad America? Or is it because that culture is backwards with backstabbing, paranoia, and all? I don't want to speak and slander Iraqis and Syrians or Chinese, but I'll speak of Iranians. Iranians, 99.9% are in paranoia mode, but also in, this person. Like, I had people who support the government, the regime, when I was like commenting and going to spaces to educate myself on Iran, who were like, this guy has to be some kind of Zionist, monarchist American psyop. I'm like, you're wrong. But then I also had people that were like opposed to the regime, despite the fact that I'm a secular Canadian entrepreneur in Canada, whatever. They were like, this guy's clearly a regime. He's clearly like paid by the government. I'm like, you're morons. You're both morons. You're both royally stupid. But what I'm saying is I realized that I go, oh, Iran is a shithole, not because of America, but because of this kind of thinking. So to go back to 1953, the reason why all that shit happened is ultimately because of infighting. If you go back to 1979 and the revolution, 10% of 40 million Iranians did the revolution because of the traits of the people, right? So now let's talk about North America. In North America, you have all the freedom in the world to speak your mind, which means you could also say the government, if I go out there and say Donald Trump was behind 9/11, he would sue me probably for defamation, so I wouldn't. But somebody could say that, and whatever, there's no real repercussions. But it's also then the combination of the lack of awareness and history and total ethnocentrism that then leads to a lot of conspiracy theories. And so I think it's, we've always said it. If you want to understand something, look at humanities, look at social sciences, and sociology, anthropology, to me, explains a lot of the dysfunction in certain countries. It's not that complicated.
We kind of alluded to this before, but there is a sort of conspiracy economy that exists. And so there are people that profit off of the proliferation of conspiracy theories. So on social media and alternative media outlets too, like there's a bunch of them now. If you look at InfoWars, for example, I mean, that is conspiracy theory central. Alex Jones has made a small fortune, talking about conspiracies day and night. And not to say that all of them have been false, but there's been like almost anything goes, you know what I mean? And that's what gets people, is like there's always a few grains of truth that pull you in, and then you're just along for the ride, and you're getting whatever.
But the problem, okay, so I agree, and again, this is why I said that at WatchMojo, I'm like, we believe in the truth. We don't slander people. We don't defame. Even when we have fun, we have to be clear. Okay. So before we get to Alex Jones, who, by the way, as to my point, you keep pushing the envelope because you got to come up with something crazier and crazier. When he's like, the Sandy Hook thing didn't happen. I mean, at the onset, I was like, this guy's a lunatic. Not that before I was like, he's some kind of wise old man. So I think once you get into that, you do have to keep pushing the envelope, and you have to get more and more provocative. Like SNL, at some point, the kind of tepid jokes don't work. You have to push the envelope. And yes, there is the backdrop, the room, you got to read the room and the society. Me Too jokes were not funny in 2017. Now you could probably make jokes like that, and they might be tasteless, but you're not going to get canceled, right? Same thing with many other things. You could make fun of even groups that were almost sacred, that before were persecuted, now that you couldn't 5 years ago. So I think some of it is just, understanding the socio backdrop. But, he got sued in the end, right? So I don't necessarily think that I would ever advise people to play that game, but I also don't want to be a hypocrite. And I would concede that if Alex Jones became somebody or built a franchise, it is because of that playbook. It's a bit like, would I condone his actions? Never. But do I understand why he played that approach? Totally. When I started really spending more and more time online, and this was around 9/11, there was a website called What Really Happened, which probably now is pretty dead. Not necessarily, obviously media has changed. And they used to talk about UFOs. They used to talk about ghosts, I guess. They used to talk about a myriad of things. I'm sure they talked about the 1967 USS Liberty incident where the Israeli army took down a U.S. ship. But after 9/11, they went all in, right? And that became really, really popular for them, where it almost was only a 9/11 publication. It wasn't so much necessarily that the operator of the website was like, I care about this more than I care about JFK's assassination. It's because he saw this is working, so they just kept covering more and more stories. There you go. The Design hasn't changed. The Design has somehow gotten more old than I haven't even I actually have not visited this website. Oh, it's the Wayback Machine, in like a decade. But so the point I'm getting at is the same way that you had I don't know. I'm going to use Blippi as an example. Wasn't the Blippi guy doing really tasteless like skits where he was like pooping on himself or eating or doing just some?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's been like 5 different people who played Blippi over
Okay, so
time,
maybe
but
not
one of
Blippi. Okay, but one of the guys, like I mean, again, I apologize to Blippi if it's not Blippi, but I remember a few years ago, people discovered that before he was this lovable character for kids, he was doing some really raunchy stuff. Now, I was like not judging either way, but I was like, well, he was an actor. So it's like, as an actor, he was experimenting stuff. And if there was a lot of interest in the YouTube landscape for, self-defecating videos or whatever, maybe he would have continued down that path. But I think this just goes back to what I said ultimately. The democratization of media means that everybody with a phone and an internet access, hopefully my Wi-Fi stays up, is a media company. And it's clear to me that why did NBC schedule 20 seasons of Unsolved Mysteries? People were drawn to it.
Yeah.
So you can't also blame these media operators for doubling down on what works. Again, we're a bit different. If we were only doing what people loved, it would be top 10 lesbian kisses with hot actresses, top 10, death, gory scenes in horror movies. But we're like, we don't want to be.
I think it would be more like, top 10 Karens losing it at Walmart. Those like we went through a trend where those were like the hottest videos on the channel. We were like pumping out the Karen videos like over and over.
Well, one time, one of my directors who would think this is below his pay scale, he's like, "You got the chills?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "This gave us the chills. That gave us the chills." He's like, "Maybe you guys could chill down on the chill." And I wasn't even aware. But yeah, it's look, human beings. Something works, you repeat it. If I cook food and my daughters hate it, I'm probably not going to make it again. But if they like it, I'll go back to it. So it's the same thing with media. And you could comment on it, but I do draw the line at like judging in a way that's like, well, why would people do that? I mean, it's obvious.
When tech platforms like YouTube, but all of them really incentivize engagement, we know that outrage creates engagement. And so then, organizations, whatever creators are incentivized to create almost like rage bait content. What's the responsibility there that they have to kind of manage themselves when the platforms themselves are kind of like nudging you in that direction?
So there's a ethical answer and a legal answer. We'll start with the easy one. Legally, based on the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, legally, they are platforms, they are neutral, and they go, we're not here to be an arbiter of truth, nor are we here to determine who is right or wrong. So they almost have to actually be neutral, right? Like if they actually make an exception, and we'll switch to this now, to the ethics part, if they have to make an exception and be like, well, you know what, COVID videos, yeah, that might be a public health issue, so we banned them. But also because they're global, and we touched on this in an earlier episode of Inside Mojo when we talked about YouTube. If YouTube wants to operate in the EU, then they have to prevent, like in Germany, let's say, they have to prevent Holocaust denial. So it's not like there's somebody sitting there at YouTube headquarters that's like, I agree that Holocaust denial is bad, or screw that, it's freedom of speech. It's a very tactical, well, you know what? We don't want to have two sets of rules. So if the lowest common denominator is to prevent hate speech or Holocaust denial in the EU, we'll just homologate that to American rules and say, yeah, we also don't want you to do that. Like that. So it kind of becomes legal, practical, functional. Ethically, I do think that with power comes responsibility, and you should be proactive. These platforms are clearly not just like generic blank robots. It affects a lot of people. They set the agenda, and they have become news. I do not think at all that we should ever have like the FCC. I don't think the FCC or in Canada CRTC should really meddle too much with the internet, because it's still a medium that frankly is above their intelligence, for lack of a better word, like expertise. But I don't think that these platforms should be absolved if they really let anything go, right? If there's like a kid in Michigan who's like, I'm going to teach students how to go out and kill as many students in a 5-minute window before the cops come and blow my brains out. Yeah, you know what? I pretty much would love YouTube to take that video down. There's no value there's value if you're a serial killer, but there's no value whatsoever to society for you to go out and teach people how to shoot 1,000 people in 5 minutes. Like you can't, and you could be a freedom of speech absolutist until little Joey comes and blows up your kid Scott's brain, and then you probably would mind, right? So that's also the hypocrisy and the lack of intellectual honesty. So I do think, though, that aside from the very clear legal approach of what we discussed, and you don't want them to be like, we are in charge, like the EU would be like this, where some technocrat would be like the arbiter of truth, and that's also bad. But I do think that these platforms do have a bit of a responsibility. Now, all Animal Farm, all platforms are equal, some more than others. There is, and we could do another show. I think it's a bit different for X versus Facebook, Meta, Instagram versus TikTok. Forget the whole Chinese ownership versus YouTube. I think each one has their own reality. If I decide to do just a very informative, like Greenlight, top 10 facts about Tiananmen Square in China, fair game on YouTube. YouTube itself is banned in China. I don't think anything happens. I don't think I would even be able to upload that on TikTok. Now, somebody could scream censorship, and you could argue it's censorship, but it's their freaking property. So it's also, at what point do I say, well, it's the Chinese IP asset? Like if they don't allow this, go put it elsewhere, right? So it's not so much that there aren't clear truths or like right or wrongs, but it's a big business, and you have to kind of navigate that, and that also creates opportunity.
There's one more thing I wanted to ask you about before we wrap it up. So early this year, they launched this task force on the declassification of federal secrets. And so the goal was to oversee the declassification of the JFK, RFK, and MLK assassination records, as well as information on Epstein, UAPs, 9/11 files, and COVID-19 origins. So they've been working on this, and there's been a lot of discourse, particularly recently, about the Epstein files and struggles over declassifying some of the documents. What I want to know is basically, do you think that these are actually, this is a task force that is like a hero for transparency, or is this just more political theater that we're witnessing?
I don't want to take the easy way out and say both. I'm a very big, you see my style at the company. I'm pretty transparent. I'm very transparent. I also personally believe that the truth comes out, right? So if my daughter were to come to me and be like, did you ever smoke weed? And I'll be like, I wouldn't lie to them. To me, it doesn't make sense because the truth comes out. And then if you lie to them, you're giving people disincentive to come to you. And I don't want like you, if I had a work-related question, to go behind my back. I'd be like, just ask me. So let's set aside my personal disposition. I think the government should generally be more out of affairs than in. But I also think that from a process of elimination, you can't have like your neighbor Shelley and your Aunt Karen running that commission either. So I am all for it, so long as it's then fully transparent. If the government wants to shepherd and organize the process and speak to people, I'm fine with that because I do think, well, who else? You're not going to hire Ernst & Young to come and do that. You could, but it's not going to happen. But then when the government actually does something, for them to put out some kind of redacted bullshit with a bunch of black lines, shut the fuck up. Like you're wasting.
That annoys everybody.
Yeah. I don't know. That doesn't help because then it adds more questions than not. So I think, again, being a practical person, it's the government's function. That is the government's role. But then it's got to be really clear. And by the way, what's up with the something K acronyms and all these people whose brains were blown out? MLK, JFK, RFK. Note to self, if you have 3 letters in your name and it ends with K, maybe stay inside.
Yeah. Well, another question that a lot of people have is like, what is the point of continuing to have classified documents for things that happened like 60 years ago? Like all of the people, I guess some of the people involved might still be alive, but I mean, it's just so long ago that what reason could there be for hiding it?
Okay, I get that the people may be dead, Hoover, Roosevelt, like whatever old folks dead, that's fine. I don't think their families should even have a say in it because that's too bad there. I think it's more the organizations, right? Like, so if you're the CIA, you're still a going concern. You're still around. So if it comes out that you did something shady, people are going to question you. When I want to kind of send an email out, let's say to my board, I will sometimes send it to 4 or 5 colleagues to be like, what do you think before I say this? And then somebody could come and be like, well, I would remove this paragraph. Or if something's even a better example, if somebody goes, well, I feel like Ash is taking a shot at me, then in that case, they might want to redact that effectively. They're like, oh, don't mention this because I look bad. So I think that's really ultimately what's happens, right? It's kind of somebody who reads it and they're afraid that it reduces their power, it hurts their credibility, so it's redacted. And it's bullshit, but I'm just explaining what generally happens.
Yep, I agree with you. This has been a fun conversation, and I would like to segue into next week's episode in which we will be going inside UAPs, which I'm very excited about this because this is like my domain. I've been researching this extensively over the past year for our podcast Unveiled. And there's a big film coming out tomorrow called The Age of Disclosure, which I'm really looking forward to talking to you about. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So, yeah.
And are you going to call the episode Inside UAP or Inside UFO?
I might just call it Inside Disclosure because that's, you know, that kind of is a catch-all, and that's what everybody is really interested in.
No, I'm looking forward to it. And as I said, as a young, person who believed in all that and still kind of do, no, it should be fun. Yeah. But I may be the one asking you more questions because you have grown into the expert in this field, which is good.
Well, we may also have a guest joining us, so I think we might be 3 people on the call. So, yeah, more information to dissect there, and I'm looking forward to watching that film. So, stay tuned for that next week.
Earthling or from the outer space? I'm kidding.
I'll leave that'll be a surprise for next week. You'll see.
All right, very nice. All right, have a good one.
You too, Ash. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.